The magnificent chandelier hanging from the ceiling glowed like a cascade of frozen light, casting a warm golden hue over the candlelit tables below. Le Chateau Elegance was renowned for its opulence and sophistication, a place where the elite gathered to sip vintage wine and discuss important matters: business, inheritance, art, and occasionally, scandal. Tonight, the restaurant was more crowded than ever. The chatter of diners blended with the clinking of crystal glasses, the polite laughter of the aristocracy, and the soft clatter of silverware against fine porcelain. In a grand hall corner, a group of distinguished guests, dressed in elegant attire, savored exquisite dishes, served by a meticulously trained staff who always remained in the background. A flower among faded memories. Among the waitstaff that evening was Elise Monroe, a young black woman who had spent the entire night gracefully maneuvering between tables. Her uniform, though pristine, could not change how she was perceived, just another worker, an invisible part of the backdrop in a world where she did not seem to belong. But no one knew that before becoming a quiet waitress, Elise had been a violin prodigy. She grew up in a poor neighborhood, where music was her only escape from hardship. Her parents, despite their limited means, saved every penny to support her lessons. But tragedy struck when they died in a car accident when she was just 16. Her dreams of music seemed to have been buried with them. Since then, she had lived quietly, working multiple jobs to survive. Yet, every night after work, she would play her violin in her small, cramped apartment, reminiscing about the bright days she had lost. The violin that changed everything. Tonight, an unexpected event occurred. The restaurant's main musician suddenly fell ill, leaving an unsettling silence in the air. The manager panicked, worried about the absence of live music. The restaurant's perfection could not afford such a flaw. Elise hesitated for a moment, but then, as if a fire had been rekindled inside her, she stepped forward. "I can play," she said, her voice trembling but firm. The manager turned to her, astonished. But in the urgency of the moment, he had no other choice. He nodded. She took the violin. For the first time in years, she stood before an audience not to serve them but to play for them. As she placed the bow on the strings, a flood of memories surged, sitting by the window as a child, practicing for hours under her parents' watchful eyes. The first note rang out. The violin spoke in whispers of the past, a tale woven in sound. From sorrowful lows to soaring highs like cries of hope, the melody filled the room, silencing all conversation. The same eyes that had once dismissed her with indifference now shone with awe. The very guests who had ignored her presence were now entirely captivated. A woman in lace gloves clutched her wine glass tightly, seemingly lost in a distant memory. An elderly gentleman placed a hand over his heart as though something deep inside him had stirred. And the table that had once regarded her as just another servant now brimmed with admiration. Recognition. The piece ended in a lingering silence. Then, applause erupted, hesitant at first, then swelling into a thunderous ovation. Elise stood there, heart pounding. She was no longer an invisible server. She had been seen. After that night, Elise was no longer forgotten. Guests began to remember her name. Some even returned to the restaurant just to hear her play. And then, on a particularly special evening, as she lowered her bow after a performance, a man approached her. He had the air of a seasoned veteran, his silver-streaked hair and discerning eyes reflecting a deep appreciation for art. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice rich and warm. "I'm Charles Davenport, director of the symphony orchestra. I would like to invite you to audition." Elise froze. The world she thought had closed its doors forever was opening once again before her. Her heart swelled. She had not just been seen, she had been discovered. A new journey. Elise's audition was not just an opportunity, it was a turning point. She stepped into the grand concert hall, standing before the most discerning judges. She closed her eyes, lifted her bow, and once again let the music speak for her. She was accepted. The months that followed were filled with relentless practice. She transitioned from a humble waitress to a rising violinist. Night after night, she stood on larger stages before growing audiences. The applause that once belonged only to restaurant patrons now echoed from grand concert halls worldwide. And then, on a dazzling winter night, she stepped onto the stage of a renowned theater, bathed in lights, with the audience holding their breath in anticipation. Elise closed her eyes, placed the bow on the strings, and she played.